repeat.
Find somebody that feels like they're fucked in some way, and you want to speak to that. You want to speak to that feeling. Hey, wake up! Wake up! I do it sometimes when we talk about issues that I've had in real life. If I talk about like a specific problem that I've had, getting fired from my job or being poor or homeless or whatever, any stupid shit that we've gone over. You've been brainwashed! Brainwashed!
Lesson 1. Shock.
Imagine waking up one day and realizing that you were born on a completely different planet. And everything you learned was lie, and your country's history was so fabricated, and everyone around you was so brainwashed. And the heroes you worship were actually monstrous villains. This is like the plot to a science fiction novel, but it's the insane reality for North Koreans like me.
Have to dig it. Oh yeah, that's where you're gonna find us in America. They've got those in Arizona too.
If we can't live in peace, then let's die in peace.
The Democratic Party is a replacement church. It's like a cult.
The Republican Party has become a death cult.
The only conclusion they can come to is that this was some sort of insane supernatural cult.
The Republican Party, however, is a death cult.
Pain's not bad, it's good. Step from your wheelchair. Begin to step from your wheelchair. Try it. Just try it. Just try it.
And I turned in an instant and said, this is more than a kooky group. This is a crazy group, a criminally insane group. And it's not just Raniere.
Lou Castro had all of his followers believing that he was centuries old and that his body was inhabited by angels.
Here are the bleaches, the cleansers, whole length of breeze, soaps. I'm not beginning to enumerate all of it.
And it came to pass that I once spent a whole summer drinking 2 Rockstar energy drinks and eating Pop-Tarts for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and reading the Bible about 12 to 15 hours a day. I read that book front to back that summer. I have spent time both in cults, that of conspiracy theory and that of religion.
Take it! Take it! Take it!
I've studied brainwashing for years, from seeing the chemical structure of aspartame, which is the chemical found in Diet Coke, matched closely to that of tyrosine or dopamine. Reading on GMOs and plants, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the origins of superstitions, to now reading on different aerosol protection from masks on the basis of micron size. It is refreshing to see others start using Google Scholar and researching their ideas, but I hope that they just read more than just the abstract. Although I'm not here to bully anyone, or on anything really, since I'm technically here to review a film long overdue and how it relates to the Mexican experience. From the start, I also know that there's a common thread or movement away from monotheistic religions in America to toward deconstructing of the ideologies that were more prevalent in the past. RedTube, anti-SJWs, and politics entering the scene as their own strong ideology has shown a more humanitarian, or dare I say,
Utilitarian. That flavor of consequentialism is my favorite, yes.
Also, I would say that the parsing of the same religion is in part derived from the distinction of cultural identities. But I know that this is nothing new. I'm merely saying this to show you a direction of reflective properties that our society has finally placed. If it could be said in a better way, I feel like we've always had a mirror to see ourselves. But as time has passed and our connection into the void known as the internet has grown, the mirror is now cleaner than ever, of smudges and stains of the past, and we can now identify many of our own imperfections. This episode is an ocean's dive into the blue depths of the mind. We will discuss personality psychology, hypnotism, the new era of nihilism, parasocial relationships a little bit, cults, a little even Pavlov, suicidal fascism, the Leviathan, and the movie Guyana, which is the story of the People's Temple. I admit here that part of the delay as to why this review took so long is that I kept rewatching Guyana Tragedy, the story of Jim Jones. I understand how embarrassing this is, but it really exemplified the difference between a film and an exploitation film. There are so many movies created on the story of Jim Jones. The story of Jim Jones is one that is known to many, and to those of you who don't know, this is where the saying drinking the Kool-Aid comes from. And as many have pointed out to me, it was Flavor-Aid, not Kool-Aid. If you have belonged to a strong connection of any sort, and I mean any sort, from cults or Christian radical ideologies to political ideologies to even something like belonging to a fan base for a band, like the Mad Infestation into the band Neutral Milk Hotel. Even something like from the worshipping of the Beatles to the boy bands of the 90s. I once belonged to a Christian group that was incredibly obsessed with speaking in tongues. Initially, I thought it was about following the Bible, so I was definitely the only one in the group who was trying to pick in schizophrenics and homeless people off the streets, like Jesus did. And I will never forget what my preacher told me when I brought in that Russian man who claimed that the Russians were following him. He said, "Chewy, what were you thinking? We have women here. You have to protect them." Which, needless to say, had me confused since I thought Jesus led the prostitutes and sinners. But I was young. Let us begin here, with exploration versus exploitation. Rene Cardona Jr. was known as one of the most prominent low-budget exploitation filmmakers, son of the great Mexploitation director, Rene Cardona Sr., whose films included Santo contra los Monstruos. Santo films are worth a watch. Laughs are necessary for life. A good English example of this type of movie is Monster Brawl, where it's just WWE in a movie universe. But in comparison to the Santo films, where the character is taken serious, something like See No Evil is a better representation, which is just Glenn Jacobs, better known as Kane, mimicking the Texas Chainsaw Massacre's Leatherface. Exploitation films are films that jump on a trend, so similar to See No Evil jumping on the psycho killer trend during that time. Exploitation films in general jump on current trends, or sex, violence, and drugs, generally considered cheap B movies. In this case, the movie is not mexploitation, but rather just an exploitation film. Since what makes something mexploitation is generally using the elements of Mexican culture that are stereotypical, and I think we all know what those are, like narcocultura, money, crime, and sex, of course.
Please, Father, have mercy.
God has mercy. I don't.
Guyana Crime of the Century is a drama based on the true story of the People's Temple. Guyana is one of Rene Cardona Jr.'s first movies made without his father. Some of his other films exemplify the way he looked at things and allow you to almost see through his lenses. In one exploitation film he created, called Survive with an exclamation mark, it retells the story of a rugby team's plane crash. In contrast, the distinction of American cinema named a film of the same story, Alive. One depicting the willingness to live while the other depicting what we would do not to die. The idea is depicted further in what I stated in the review of The Platform, where the American title is The Platform, but in the Spanish version it is called El Hoyo, which references the hole. In a true exploitative manner, the film is released close to a year after the event occurred, and has characters with names that are almost sarcastically named thus. The name changes where, for protection, still it holds the same joking manner. Leo Ryan turns into Leo O'Brien, Jim Jones turns into James Johnson, and Dr. Larry Shaw turns into Gary Shaw. The appropriate shock value perfected begins the movie with a suicide. The man is not identified, but it is said to have been Michael Prokes, who was a spokesperson for Jim Jones, who committed suicide that day. The movie then transitions to Jim Jones speaking in a white suit, white tie, with sunglasses on, looking like Elvis. Throughout the past few decades, there has been a reversal of depictions, or doing diagnostics on villains or bad guys of sorts. We have tried to analyze why bad guys are bad guys.
You are bad guy, but this does not mean you're bad guy.
You ever imagine that maybe something you believe has been skewed by something someone once told you incorrectly? Something like, this world is not your home. After providing the appropriate shock value to the system, what some call a breaking point, here's where we get into Lesson 2 of Brainwashing. Lesson 2. White Knight Brainwashing. Now, the main reason I think it is important to develop our frame of mind is to be able to see the connections, to catch when something becomes painful to normalized, by tolerance or by reaching the threshold of a breaking point. This idea can definitely describe how something like fake news or radical ideologies in general can be perpetuated. William Sargent describes a phenomenon that even Pavlov talks about in his speech. In his book, Battle for the Mind, he writes that dogs, much like human beings, break down when stresses or conflicts become too great for their nervous system to master. While in the speech even Pavlov gave, he talked about the Leningrad flood, and the fact that the dogs almost drowned, and that once they recovered, they showed an almost opposite response to stimuli and to people, such that the dogs showed an aggressive response to those that they cared for, and showed to be docile under the ones they used to dislike. Noted the 3 distinguishable phases, the first being the equivalent phase, in which the brain reacts the same to both strong and weak stimuli. The second phase, called the paradoxical phase, in which the brain responds more actively to weak stimuli than to strong. This reminds me of research done on those who have PTSD, in which there can be a trigger that could be worse than the actual thing. Then the last being the ultra-paradoxical phase, in which the conditioned responses and behavioral patterns, turn from positive to negative and vice versa. The idea of a mental breaking point. It's really fascinating. It always begs me to wonder if this could be the same tactic used to destroy individualism by cults. By deconstructing the self and deteriorating personality into a malleable Play-Doh, we can further understand this through the movie Guyana. During the beginning of the movie, we see that a few kids try to steal some food, because as was known later, many of the people in Guyana were starving since they actually could not grow anything in the field. Ironically and incorrectly, the kids are stealing some Kool-Aid. Once they are caught, James asks the people as to what they should do with them. And this is where I think a cult can foster the most growth, or how ideas grow bigger than they would have. Notice that the discipline of the group can feel more powerful than the discipline from the leader. The parents all cry out for James to punish them. People forget that the way groupthink works is almost by default. Research has even shown that cohesion created from in-group ties releases oxytocin. Ergo, creating a more relaxed and loving environment by existing in the in-group. This is something similar to what Michel Foucault writes in Discipline and Punishment, when public punishment used to exist. Seeing the punishment is implicitly acting on the punishment. The idea of silence is violence is definitely downgraded a lot from the concept explained by Foucault. We must be careful to accept snippets or sound bites as a prayer, since they may be effective, but they are missing a lot of context. But, back in the movie, we see that the kids get punished by snakes, drowning, and shocking, and they all ask for forgiveness from James Johnson. Once the kids are punished, then James Johnson catches some teenagers getting busy and punishes the young man by making him perform sexual acts on this buff guy. The whole scene really has exploitation written all over it. Around the halfway point, the White Knight is practiced. And this was actually not the first time that the White Knight was practiced. The first times, according to testimony, was actually done back when the church was in California. It may seem basic in nature, but the reinforcement through repetition is central to reaching the breaking point and inserting ideals here. So the deconstruction of the self can best be done by repeating things over and over. In the movie, James Johnson, aka Jim Jones, repeats, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Some certain sayings even carry the disdain for self or for the unraveling of the personality. Sayings like, "You are not of this world," or "The world belongs to the devil," or that everything is meaningless. All these can be found in the Holy Book. I don't want to imply that the Bible is at fault here or any holy book are at fault. Merely that there is a set of individuals, certain people that take things too far or too literal and to the brink of breaking. Jim Jones as a preacher could have just as easily stayed a preacher, but decided to create a convent of sorts and take on the role of the Christ, and did not just want to be considered the mouthpiece of God, but wanted to be the God that you would die for instead. We are not living in the worst of times, but we are not living in the best of times. We are sort of in a teenager state of society that has just been created through new communication methods. Here's where Jim Jones deviates from the totalitarian radical preacher to fascist. I do not use that term loosely, even though the term fascist has been used pretty loosely over the past few years.
What is
I mean,
fascism?
he wasn't a fascist because he didn't have a following in the cult. Like, at minimum, it has to be there's a charismatic leader and their followers do whatever they tell them. It's like a cult.
Okay, so this is exactly what I'm talking about, okay?
But like,
this is why we need. This is why we need to
no,
stop
but
using
that's
the
the
word
very
fascist.
minimum.
And here's where we delve into lesson 3 of brainwashing. Lesson 3, reinforcing groupthink by activating the group. Collective nihilism or suicidal fascism.
Why should I have faith in a government that has deserted me and my family? And then with that mentality, people become open for conspiracy theories, for big lies, etc.
Death of a nation. A totalitarian takes over the life of all by controlling all parts of public and private life, which tries to include attitudes, morals, and beliefs of the people. The idea reminiscent of nationalism, but not entirely, with the difference remaining of a national ideology. Think Kim Jong-un. At the furthest extreme, we have fascism. Government is almost obsolete to fascism. A fascist leader drives the death energy, so always keeping the group active as a sort of loaded gun. Fascists have their people become bullets and they are ready to pull the trigger at any time. But in Jim Jones's regard, the bullet is pointing to the group itself. Hobbes spoke of the artificial man, which was the prototype of the body of man, known as the Leviathan. The Leviathan keeps growing, but instead of it being based on self-preservation, in this instance, it is based on self-destruction. The destruction then leaves the imprint on the ground, and the black shadows remain as more and more stories generate. The second half of the movie begins with Leo Ryan, who is named Lee O'Brien in this movie, who heads over to Guyana to check up on the People's Temple there. Congressman Ryan was a true investigator. Previously, he had spent 10 days at Folsom as an inmate to oversee the prison system from the inside. Here, the movie drags on, perhaps because this has become a sort of exemplar of death cults. So you are constantly waiting for the White Knight to arrive. As he interviews people, everyone says they love the convent, and James Johnson throws a huge party for him. And because Congressman Ryan never made it home to America, I don't think we'll ever know whether he felt like it was a facade or if it was real. Then somebody sends Lee a note that says that they want to leave. Once Lee confronts James about those people who want to leave, James decides to do something drastic and allow some of his cult members to take matters into their own hands. Now, during this decade, or during this time, journalists were considered very important, specifically from the Watergate scandal. So you notice that when they take pictures, it almost matches the caliber of the bullets attacking the congressman and the others. A few people die at the airstrip, and we are taken back to Johnsontown, aka Jamestown. And we finally reach the drinking of the Flavor Aid. At the very end of the movie, once the massive suicide occurs, when all the people are almost forced to drink the Flavor Aid or injected with poison. In Guyana Tragedy, you can see that they depict Jim Jones as a character study and almost tries to depict him as a hero progressivism in the beginning, to then driving his character into sexual deviation and madness. But in this movie, Guyana Cult of the Damned, Jim Jones is almost a non-character, and the movie doesn't try to justify anything he did. Guyana Cult of the Damned, although exploitative in nature, I believe it didn't pull its punches, much like Rene Cardona Jr.'s other work.
Tintorera.
It depicts something that could have just as easily happened. Really, it seems like one movie the people committed suicide and in the other one, the people were killed. But either way, when it comes to brainwashing, I believe that the group was definitely activated from the first White Knight. I remember reading sociological papers on suicide bombers and studying conceptual frameworks, and how their altruism was extremely high. But by the time they had reached the event of the bombing, they had started to have second thoughts. In the tape recorded from the last moments at Jamestown, you can hear some of the hesitation from some of his churchgoers.
Is it too late for Russia?
This being said, there may have been much more force than we are led to believe in Guyana Tragedy, that more closely resembles Guyana Cult of the Damned. There's a personality assessment known as the Big Five Ocean Personality Test, which measures openness to ideas, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Contradictory to what you may believe or what may seem commonplace, Research done regarding hypnotism and the ocean test has shown that people who score higher in openness are easier to hypnotize. So, if you are open to new ideas, you may just accidentally pick up some bad ideas along the way. Even from the readings I have done regarding neurotheology, you see there has to be a decrease in activity in the parietal lobe. During meditation and intense prayer, something happens at these times and people will feel like they are connected to everything and everything is them. From what I read, I also don't believe it's far-fetched to imagine ourselves being caught up in radical ideas. So in conclusion, because of the traits we've discussed, we must always remember to go outside and touch grass. So, stop doing those things. Stop watching Twitch or binging Netflix. Stop staying still. Rene Cardona Jr. may have pushed out exploitation films nonstop, but he at least tried something. So remember to take risks. Pick up something and go do it. The nihilism derived from the detachment of parasocial relationships will grow into something else when you realize that the world is out there.